Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to finish up Chapter 7 as we take a look at the final considerations for selection and staffing human resources. Now, today we're going to be taking a look at interviews. What kind of interviews are there? How do you conduct an interview? And what are some more considerations when it comes to the legal aspect of what you can consider as far as a hiring qualification, or what things are exempt that you need to stay away from? So today, let's finish up our selecting human resources. Well, today we're going to be finishing up Chapter 7, and today we're going to be looking at background checks. We're going to be looking at interviews and the different types of interviews that you can conduct when you're doing staffing. Now, when it comes to selection interviews, you have, first of all, the impetus or the reason for it, and that's to obtain more information about the candidates. All you're really going to get from a resume is a commercial, and that's what I call resumes. They're nothing but just a commercial to get your foot in the door. And when I counsel people on getting jobs, the first thing you want to try to do with that resume is just get them to call. You go step by step. You don't put the cart before the horse. The resume or the application is designed to get you in the door. Once you get in the door, then you have the interview. And when we have the interview, this is where they can talk to you a little bit more in depth about your experience, your accomplishments, and so forth. And it's to provide information and reinforce the employer brand. That means they're talking to you about themselves. You're talking to them about yourself, so you come to a better awareness of the other. It's conducted at 2 levels, and here you see the initial screening interview, and to your right you see in-depth selection interview, and in the middle you assess the qualifications of the applicant throughout the whole process. The initial screening interview is just designed to see whether or not you're going to make the cut for the next phase. And you can have several, more than just 1 or 2 interviews. You can have 3 or 4 as they weed out the least qualified and try to find the most qualified person. But throughout the whole thing, they are assessing you. Now, there's an issue of interview quality. Selection interviews must meet the same standards for reliability and validity. So if you remember, reliability is gleaning consistent results, and validity is measuring what it's designed to measure. And how do you accomplish that? Well, you have intra-rater reliability, and that's consistency within the same interviewer. That interviewer is going to perhaps conduct an interview on Monday, and if they call you back and that interview does it again, the interview again on Thursday, we should be able to get the same results. Inter-rater reliability is the measure of consistency across different interviewers. So if I rated you a 10 on Monday and someone else interviewed you on Thursday and rated you a 10, then there's some consistency there between interviewers. Now, structured interviews are those interviews that are really not up to conversation. They're straight to the point, factual information. One is biographical interview, and that focuses on the chronological assessment of the candidate's past experiences. You're taking a look at the person's resume and you're asking them questions about their past experience or that application that gives their work history. You're asking them questions about their previous experiences in work and so forth. Behavioral interview. Applicants give specific examples of how they have performed a certain task. For instance, I put in my resume one time that as a manager for a company, I saved them X amount of thousands of dollars within a relatively small amount of time. Well, things like that, they're going to want to talk to me about. they're going to call me in because the company is all about saving money and being productive. Every company is that way. So when you start quantifying your biography and what you have done that have stood out, that's going to get their attention, and that's going to have them call you back. So I put there, I saved the company, let's say $100,000 in 3 months and increased productivity. Well, here they're going to be asking, how did you do that? So this is a way that you can talk about how you have accomplished certain things. And don't give them everything. You can tell them, well, if I'm hired, I'd love to do the same thing with you, but I dealt with this, and this, and it reaped these results. If you tell them everything, then they can go out and apply it themselves, and they may not even need you. Situational interview. Questions about how applicants might handle specific job situations. And again, you're a manager on the floor, and one of your workers starts to complain and becomes very agitated and even to the point of violence. How would you handle that? So you're given situations here, and you would have to explain what you would do. Now, the benefits of structured interviews, they ensure that a given interviewer has similar information on each candidate. Just as an application will bring about standardized answers across the board, so too will a structured interview if you follow that script. You have greater consistency in the subsequent evaluation of candidates, and many applicants can be effectively evaluated and compared. And probably one of the best benefits is that you can avoid lawsuits. No one can say, well, I was asked different questions because I'm a woman, or I was Hispanic, or whatever. If you do a structured interview where the questions are standard, then no one can say they had an unfair disadvantage against someone else. Now, less structured interviews, here's where you let them elaborate on a little bit. Tell me, what is your greatest weakness? Or what are your greatest strengths? Or what do you see yourself being in 5 years from now? These are less structured. You get a more in-depth analysis of that person, but then again, you do open yourself up to ask one person a question, and then you may forget to ask it with the next person. So there's a little less structure there, and oftentimes, as you see here, the interviewer improvises because they ask questions that are not predetermined. A semi-structured interview, you guide the conversation, which broad questions are asked and new questions arise as a result of the discussion. Counselors do this. Tell me about a time when you were angry, and the person may say, well, I was angry because of the current events. And you may stop and ask them, what do you mean by current events? So just going back and forth and structuring and guiding that conversation would be an example of a semi-structured interview. A group interview is where several candidates are interviewed together, and you may get a question or two, and other people are given a question or two. So it's not a one-on-one type of thing. A whole group is being interviewed. I've never done one of those. I have had group interviewers come and ask me questions, but I've always been by myself as the interviewee. And then non-directive interview. And they use questions developed from the answers to previous questions. So when I gave my response to saving the company money, they may ask, well, how do you save the company money? And I may answer that, and then they would come up with other questions that are guided more towards money and saving money than anything else. Now, effective interviewing. Interviewing skills are developed through training and practice. There is no textbook preparation for it. We can teach you principles and all of that, but really getting in there and dealing with people as the interviewer will hone in your skills. And you'd want to plan the interview. Don't have anything just off the cuff. Make sure you've written out and you've rehearsed the interview. talking about the questions you want to ask. Control the interview. A lot of times you're going to be challenged with people who just want to ramble on. They want to talk about things they want to talk about. They want to continue with explaining everything. And you have to realize that you're on a time schedule. You don't have all the time in the world to be interviewing people. So you have to control that situation. Use effective questioning techniques. Get a balanced view, and you want to make sure you're not looking at a person one-dimensionally, but you get a holistic assessment of that person. There's questions that you need to avoid, yes or no questions. Now, that can go either way depending on the question. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Well, I don't want their history, their criminal record. I want to know if they've ever been convicted of a felony. Obvious questions. I wouldn't, offhand, I don't know of any obvious questions. How do you like our company? And that may warrant a no-brainer. Well, I like your company. You know what they're going to say. Questions that rarely produce a true answer. Have you ever stolen anything in your life? Well, if you have ever taken a paper clip from a company, you've stolen. So that has to be, curtailed. Leading questions. You really want this job, don't you? Or tell me about a time when you were successful and you were successful doing this and this, right? So that would be leading questions. Inappropriate or illegal questions. Are you single? Are you married? And questions that are not job related. Are you single? Are you married? So that would go along the same lines. Listening responses to avoid. Nodding, pausing, making casual remarks, echoing, and mirroring. Now, again, these are suggestions because there are times when I needed them to clarify something or I wanted to make sure I understand them. And I would say, let me make sure I understand you correctly. You said you saved the company $600,000 in 3 months. Is that correct? So they would say, yeah. So, something like that, you just have to play it by ear. Some of the problems when you're doing interviews is making snap judgments about a person. There is the halo effect, and we'll see that here, the third list down, or the third one down. But making snap judgments about people, they may come in and they may not be dressed the way that you would like. Now, don't get me wrong, dressing is important for the interview, and you shouldn't take that casually. But if the person comes in and maybe they had some mud on their shoes, and you may make the judgment right then, well, this person is sloppy, they're not a very well-kept individual. Well, it might have been they might have just stepped in some mud on the way to the interview, and they didn't have time to, clean it off or whatever, or they might not have noticed it. So just don't make snap judgments. Negative emphasis. Looking at a person and basing everything off of maybe a first impression that might not have gone the way it should have gone. Maybe you have a negative impression of a person. The halo effect is the opposite. You have a chemistry with that person, or they say something, or there's something about them that you like from the very beginning, and you're going to bias everything towards the positive for that person because you did find something that you could relate to or you liked about them. Biases and stereotyping, we talked about that, and then cultural noise. There are a lot of lawsuits out there today because of just this thing here. A person who comes into a job and they're a Buddhist and you're a Christian, you don't want to hire them, and they find out about it, you're sued. Or the same thing for a Wiccan not wanting to hire a Muslim, or a black not wanting to hire a white, or vice versa. Cultural barriers can get in the way with the interview. So try to alleviate all of that. Now, background investigations, As we said, they can get you into a lot of trouble if you don't do them right or not do them at all. But with a background investigation, you're looking at their past history, job records, credit history, testing records, educational and certification records. These are all examples of background investigations that you need to be aware of. Any drug tests that need to be done, you can do that certainly. You have criminal history, sex offender lists, motor vehicle records, military records. There was a man who he and his wife wanted to serve in my church, and they wanted to work with children. And we did a background check on him, and come to find out, years ago, he was a child pornography producer, and he was arrested for that. And even though he says that he has repented and has overcome that, you never want to put a person in a position that will bring up old temptations. That's being a stumbling block. But if we had not done the proper background investigation, we would have never found him or found him out. So background investigations, you can't assume anything about anybody. You need to do them. Now, negligent hiring is when you fail to check a person's background and that person does something to someone else, injury, steals from them, whatever, you can be liable. Negligent retention is knowing that a person has a past or a condition that is unfit for work, but yet you keep on letting them work. So that's negligent retention. And these are just some more legal constraints. You need to have a signed release from the applicant so that they can't say your privacy was violated. And the investigation should be relevant to the job and the business necessities. So mainly jobs that employ people, equipment, and so forth require some level of background investigation, even if it's as simple as drug testing. I don't care how big your organization is or what you do. You don't want people strung out on drugs working for your company. So you want to make sure you do your due diligence and make sure that you are checking them out and that the background investigation is pertinent to that job. The Fair Credit Reporting Act requires that anybody working with financial documents, particularly money, needs to have a credit check done on them. But it's a disclosure that you have to disclose that you're doing a credit check, and you need written consent for that person being checked. If you want to work at a bank, they do all kinds of credit reporting background checks, and you don't have to consent, but you won't work at the bank. And if they find out that you have a history or that you have bad credit or whatever, that could be a factor because it is a BFOQ. When you're working with money and you're behind or in debt, that could be a temptation for you to take from the company. So it's a security measure that many of them do. You need to furnish the applicant with a copy of the report, and credit checks should not be for jobs in which use of, access to, or management of money is a job function. So it should be for jobs where you're dealing with money, and banks, financial institutions, credit unions, and so forth, these would fit that criteria. Employers do conduct criminal backgrounds to avoid negligent hiring, lawsuits, and I don't just do at my church a local check. I do a federal check to make sure there are no federal cases pending, or if a person doesn't have a federal case. I do a national check. Now, you can work with agencies who do background checks, and they come for a comprehensive one. For us, I believe it was around $90, but that's $90 well spent when you're making sure that you are taking care of the physical security of not only your organization but your people. You have to perform them consistently. and fairly across different employees. You can't just single people out for one and not do the other. Medical exams, the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, prohibits pre-employment medical exams except for drug tests. You have to treat the person just like a person who is not handicapped up until the point where you are looking at hiring them. And you can't reject them because they have a disability unless hiring them provides a undue hardship on the organization. So, for instance, if you have a person who is blind, and I've heard Starbucks right now is trying to figure out a way to hire people who are blind and deaf. Well, that is an undue hardship right now unless they can find equipment that won't scald them or burn them or whatever, and they work in confined spaces. So there are different kind of safety issues with that. So even with a person that can see and can hear, it can be, I'm sure, pretty hazardous. But normally, the company has to make what's called reasonable accommodation, which the law has kind of given us an idea of about $500. It may be building a ramp or some equipment or furniture that might be more conducive to people with handicaps and so forth or disabilities. So if you can make reasonable accommodation, then you need to hire them if they're in all other respects the most qualified. If not, if it's an undue burden or a hardship to hire them, that means if they place themselves in danger or endanger others around them because of their employment, you don't have to hire them. But pre-employment medical exams, you can't do that until you have conditionally made an offer. Drug testing, I have had several types. I've had urine test, blood test, hair, where they clipped off a piece of my hair. The most accurate are the ones that are the most invasive. I think the one where they took off a piece of my hair or clipped off a lock was the most accurate because it goes back further. I guess it gets into your hair follicles and it stays there. But you have to make sure that, first of all, you're fair across the board. The accuracy of these tests vary, and positive tests, you should test them again just to make sure. And the type of job will determine how stringent that screening will be. Now, when you make the job offer, I don't know of many that have offered a job over the phone. Normally, they will send you a letter or they'll call you in, but you can have it over the phone. A letter can be sent, and other documents or offer documents should be reviewed by legal counsel, especially if you're looking at long-term contracts. A lot of people, the average employee, they're just glad to have a job. And you normally will negotiate salaries or wages at the very beginning. Well, this is how much this job pays, take it or leave it, what have you. And most of that stuff is covered at the very beginning. Executives are more comprehensive. This is where you start negotiating, first of all, the employment conditions, but also if you're ever terminated, you have a severance package that you can negotiate too. So whatever you do, especially if it's a very detailed or type of job that requires that type of documentation, you need to have counsel look at it. And the terms and conditions should be clarified. You can either accept it or reject it, depending on the terms. And once you are hired, the employer places that in your personnel files, the paperwork, the contract, everything. Now, one of the last things I want to talk about today is global staffing issues, and that's expatriates. Expatriates are people who, let's say, for instance, they're citizens of America, if we're using America as an example, but your company has gone global and they need you to go overseas to run the operation. Well, at that point, you would be considered an expatriate. So you have a host country, which is the country of the place where the person lives and the company headquarters is located. You have third country nationals also, where you're going to the other place. But expatriates are one who leaves their home to go overseas to manage an operation. And there are benefits to it because you know the company, you know what's expected, you become a better manager as a result of going and working in the same industry, in the same company, and the people glean from your expertise over there. The downside to it is that it's very hard to keep people over there once the fun and the sightseeing is over with and you realize that there may not be a 24-hour restaurant open or a gas station or movies or some of the creature comforts that we have grown used to. Some countries don't even have that. So culture shock starts to set in and you become homesick. And we've oftentimes had to bring back those expatriates because they just couldn't adapt to the culture or the values or whatever, or just the living arrangements of that country. So a formal training program can help in that, where you give them the resources they need to adjust and to be able to assimilate into that country. Well, hopefully after today you understand a little bit more about the interview process and the types of interviews that are available for you to utilize. You know, a structured interview is safer, it's more to the point, and it leaves less room for applicants to be able to stray from what's important about that job. However, the less structured, you can glean more information about that person and maybe get a more in-depth analysis of that individual than you would with the structured approach. Either way is okay as long as you make it standard across the board with all applicants and you don't give anyone else unequal consideration than the other ones that you have been using. Well, that's enough for today. I hope you have a good weekend, and we'll come back next week with Chapter 8. God bless you, and have a good time off.